I know you're watching now, and I know you're feeling uncertain about the way things have changed, but you still remember it, don't you? A time when sunglasses, trench coats, martial arts, and techno ruled the entertainment landscape. Look, I don't have much time left. Once this message ends, we'll show them how awesome things were, and still could be, because the real cool can't stay asleep forever. Welcome back to the real world.
Thanks for joining me for another deep dive into the wonderful world of 90s cool. Since it's been a while since we've been here, let's take a moment to get back up to speed. 90s cool is the cinematic style of cool that was popular in the 1990s and early 2000s. This style had a recognizable aesthetic that came from a mix of cyberpunk and dark fantasy influences, with sunglasses, leather, trench coats, and tactical gear being common features. Other common signifiers include anti-hero characters, slick martial arts and gun-fu action, and a soundtrack filled with alternative music. The term 90s cool came from this quote from Redlettermedia's review of the film Blade.
Isn't it weird how dated, how poorly aged the 90s cool is?
Jay's take on this era aging poorly generated a lot of spicy comments on my last video. And while I don't really share that sentiment, when I heard the term 90s cool for the first time, something clicked. I've always felt that the dark action trend of that time was a clear, unified movement that was never named. And at that moment, someone finally gave it a good tagline. Now that we're all caught up, I think it's time to don our sunglasses and trench coats once again. Because until now, I've only scratched the surface on what this genre has to offer. In the time since my last video was published, the topic has evolved a lot thanks to some great discussion in the comments. And I feel that now is a great time to explore these ideas further. With all that in mind, this video has two aims. The first is to introduce the timeline of the 90s cool era, which started in 1991 and ended in 2009. This timeline can be divided into 4 distinct phases. In this video, I'll discuss the first 2 phases that both took place within the 1990s decade. Once that's finished, I want to address the biggest topic of contention in my last video. And that was the question, why should we call this style 90s cool if it was also big in the 2000s? And while I do have an answer, I think it'll make more sense once we've gone through the timeline. So I hope you're all ready to party like it's 1999 again, because it's time for 90s cool to make its triumphant return. But before we get there, let's take a brief look at the influences of 90s cool. As you might expect, most of the essential influences on 1990s media came from the decade that preceded it. The 1980s was arguably the most innovative period in pop culture history. It was an era ruled by the action hero, with ripped muscles, a glorious mullet, and a massive machine gun. And while the action heroes were dominating the mainstream standard of cool, the decade also had a darker side. There were gritty, sci-fi classics like Blade Runner and RoboCop, the cool young gang of rebel vampires in The Lost Boys, Tim Burton's gothic adaptation of Batman, the urban sword fights of Highlander, and the emerging popularity of Japanese animation and Hong Kong action in the West. By the early 90s, the 80s cultural dominance was on its last leg. Gen X was taking over and making entertainment that suited their tastes. Not long into the decade, the counterculture movement blew up, with bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam leading the charge. But what often gets overlooked is that grunge wasn't the only thing on the rise. This alternative explosion also set the stage for the decade to find its own cinematic style of cool. And with that, we finally entered the 90s cool era, which started with Phase 1, Proto 90s cool, 1991 to 1993. The 90s cool era began with a 3-year period of explosive pop culture innovation, with many creative influences converging to make something new. It was a seismic shift that began with one movie, the father of 90s cool, James Cameron's Terminator 2. T2 was a groundbreaking film that set the bar for action-packed special effects spectacles. It also had an undeniable cool factor that established the look of action movies for the rest of the decade. In his second outing as the Terminator, Arnold's outfit was like an updated, modernized version of his look from the first movie. It consisted of a shiny leather jacket and pants set with a black t-shirt and boots. Arnold himself had a trimmer physique, which was in line with the more athletic shape of modern action heroes. But the standout part of the look were his now iconic Persol brand sunglasses. These stylish shades made sports sunglasses the new standard of cool. Alongside Arnold, Linda Hamilton also had an all-new, round sunglasses and tactical gear-laden wardrobe. In one sweep, these two characters set the foundation of cool that the rest of the decade would build on. Terminator 2 is the biggest film of 1991 and may have had enough sway to redefine the 90s all on its own. But it wasn't alone. In the same year, U2 completely overhauled their sound for their smash album, Achtung Baby. This sound came with a new image as Bono left behind his 80s folk rock look for a flashy, black leather outfit, complete with his now signature sunglasses. As a result, in 1991, the protagonist of the biggest movie in the world and the lead singer of arguably the biggest band in the world looked like this. From then on, these dark fashion statements kept popping up in high-profile areas. In 1992, the now iconic line of gangsters and Reservoir Dogs reinforced sunglasses as the coolest thing ever. Then there was Michelle Pfeiffer's sexy, skin-tight black leather catsuit in Batman Returns. In 1993, Jurassic Park featured Jeff Goldblum as the definitive cool guy mathematician, with his leather jacket and dark shades. And then Tombstone gave us the image of Doc Holliday in his flowing black duster. By then, it was safe to say that bright and colorful was out and dark and mysterious was in. Beyond the aesthetic that was quickly forming, there were so many moving pieces in those years that quickly changed the culture. For now, I'll briefly touch on the more important parts. In 1992, John Woo released what many consider to be the greatest gun fu movie ever made, Hard Boiled. Woo's style had a sizable impact on the rest of the decade as he made his American action debut with 1993's Hard Target. Also in 1992, Todd McFarlane debuted his anti-hero comic book series, Spawn. Spawn was a huge success that helped define the edgy era of 90s comics. Vampires continued to enjoy a renaissance of popularity, with the debut of the Vampire the Masquerade tabletop game in 1991 and the release of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula in 1992. Violent video games made their gory mark on pop culture in 1993 with the one-two punch of Doom and Mortal Kombat 2. The classic anime film, Akira, garnered many new fans thanks to its home video release in Western countries. In short, the amount of pop culture innovation and integration that happened during those years was staggering. But at a certain point, one movie had to rise to the occasion and put all of these pieces together. And that finally happened in 1994, which was the year that brought us into Phase 2, the Golden Dark Age, 1994 to 1999. This phase marks when the cultural 80s were fully in the rearview mirror, and the counterculture spirit of the 90s had taken over. On the big screen, this change was best represented by one movie, Alex Proyas's gothic masterpiece, The Crow. The Crow was a film that completely captured the moment. Its main character was a dark, brooding anti-hero who dressed like a gothic rock star. It introduced a slick action style that blended martial arts, gun fu, and sword fights all into one package. And most importantly, its alternative soundtrack set the foundation that all others would follow. By that time, the 90s cool look became an integral part of the fashion landscape. For instance, in 1995, it was the primary style of the biggest film of the year, Joel Schumacher's Batman Forever. Common staples of the look included sports and T-shade sunglasses, glossy leather and latex, long coats and black boots, among other things. This attire was present in many music videos from that era as it became a staple of nightlife culture. The presence of this style only grew stronger as the decade progressed. Perhaps its greatest ally in entertainment was professional wrestling. So many famous wrestlers like the NWO, Sting, D-Generation X, and The Brood wore the look with flair. At the same time, Hong Kong action was also completing its Hollywood invasion. This takeover is evident in films like Desperado and Tomorrow Never Dies. In addition, Japanese animation had a major breakthrough in the West with the release of Ghost in the Shell in 1995. Ghost in the Shell was a seminal piece of cyberpunk fiction that had a huge influence on many things going forward. By then, the decade had its own look, sound, and action style, but there was still one more crucial piece of the puzzle. In the 90s, many films adopted a dystopian, grungy look that I'll refer to as film grunge. This style was characterized by dark environments like gloomy nighttime streets, decaying buildings, dingy bars, and grimy industrial areas. The people in these movies often looked unkempt and damaged. Although it's never been stated directly, this style often seemed like an artistic representation of the way the heroin epidemic was ravaging large cities at that time. With that final piece, the 90s cool style was complete. And as we approached the new millennium, the hits just kept coming. In 1998, Blade took everything about the style to the next level. Metal Gear Solid was a blockbuster success that proved that video games could be just as cinematic as films. Shiny leather and grungy environments were all over music videos. The trend seemed like an unstoppable force that could only be slowed down by some kind of unprecedented event. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened on April 20th, 1999. That day, 2 high school students committed a heinous act that shook the foundations of American society, known as the Columbine High School Massacre. Once this horrific event became the biggest news story in America, the 2 teenagers, who often wore trench coats, sunglasses, and combat boots, were widely reported as being members of a local alternative group called the Trenchcoat Mafia. As a result, this look became synonymous with their actions. This tragedy put a stigma around trenchcoat fashion and a lot of alternative media that sadly never went away. Moving on to a lighter topic, the year 1999 also gave us the film that represented the pinnacle of 90s cool, The Matrix. The Matrix took everything cool in that era and made it bigger and better. It was a special effects spectacle with mind-blowing martial arts and gun fu action. Neo, Trinity, and Morpheus all had awesome outfits, and the style never looked better. And its soundtrack was a tour de force of exhilarating alternative music. The movie was so impactful that it still stands as an emblematic piece of the cultural zeitgeist at the turn of the millennium. And with that concludes the first 2 phases of the 90s cool era, the time period when the trend was founded, defined, and reached its all-time peak. In my follow-up video to this one, I'll talk about the next 2 phases, and they are the post-Matrix boom period, which lasted from 2000 to 2004, and the death spiral, which lasted from 2005 to 2009. Now that we've covered the first 2 parts of the timeline, I want to address the question that I received the most on my last video, and that is, why do you call this style 90s cool if it was also big in the 2000s? To answer this question, let's think of the first 2 phases we just discussed as a movie. Within the 1990s decade, the 90s cool movie had an explosive start, a great middle act, and a perfect ending. If the world had actually ended in the year 2000, then this trend had a satisfying conclusion that didn't need a sequel. So for me, even though the trend continued in the 2000s, it will always belong to the decade that made it. The 2000s era was more like the cash-in sequel, a sequel that represented the best and the worst of the trend. With that said, when I made my previous list of best films, I agree that grouping together the 90s and 2000s movies was a confusing way to introduce the topic. And since it was my first kick at the can, I also left off a number of movies that deserved to be there. Because of that, in this video, I want to reboot my list and give you the best 90s cool movies that were all released in the 1990s decade. Now, here's where things get difficult. Not everything 90s cool was made equal. Some movies like Blade, for example, are no-brainer choices. But in other cases, it's difficult to choose which movies meet the standard and which ones don't. In order to find the strongest examples of the genre, I made a list of the 5 core features that can help us define a 90s cool movie, which starts with Number 1. 90s cool fashion. A dark outfit that made its wearer look cool and mysterious. Some signifiers of this look include sports and round-shaped sunglasses, shiny leather and latex, trench coats, catsuits, formal wear, and combat gear. These outfits are usually mostly black or other dark colors like gray and crimson. Number 2. Film grunge. Heavily stylized, dark and dreary environments that evoke the feeling of a graphic novel. Some common features include dark cityscapes, decaying buildings, grimy industrial areas, and disheveled people. Number 3. Bad Boys. By the 90s, your Top Gun patriotic hero was out, and morally complex rebels were in. Common character types include freedom fighters, hitmen, assassins, dirty cops, or even truly evil protagonists like mass killers. Number 4. 90s cool action. This action style blended Hollywood action with Hong Kong influences like martial arts and gun fu, with the occasional sword fight. Number 5. An alternative soundtrack. These films often had a soundtrack that displayed their allegiance to the counterculture movement. Other tropes of 90s cool include a nightclub scene, dual-wielding pistols, weird futuristic technology, and vampires. The lime green and black color combination also showed up a lot. By using these 5 elements, I found what I believe are the 20 movies that best represent 90s cool in its decade of origin. These movies don't need to have every single element to qualify, but the more they have, the better. Now before we get into the list, here are some honorable mentions. Here are the best 90s cool movies, all released in the 1990s. Number 20. Bad Boys, 1995. Bad Boys was the feature film directorial debut of Michael Bay. The movie immediately established Bay's well-known style, which consists of fast-paced, explosive action set pieces interspersed with sports cars, eye candy, and comedy bits. Bay's style may be a little crass for some, but I think it hits here. And that's because Bad Boys knows exactly what kind of movie it is. A big, dumb, and fun action comedy. The glue that holds everything together is the pairing of Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. The two of them had so much chemistry together, with a genuine feeling of a funny sibling rivalry between them. Their acting chemistry undoubtedly contributed so much to the film's success. It was also a vital step in Will Smith's rise to superstardom. And right alongside him, Leonardo DiCaprio was also going places with movies like Number 19, Romeo and Juliet, 1996. Didst thee not seeth this film in thy English class? Baz Luhrmann's bold adaptation of Romeo and Juliet put a modern twist on the William Shakespeare classic. Instead of simply doing a straightforward, modernized retelling of the play, the film kept the Shakespearean language and set the story in a hyper-stylized comic book world. The combination of these elements made for a bizarre but unforgettable experience. For people like me who watched it in school while learning about the play, the film made Romeo and Juliet much easier to identify with. It had such a talented young cast who really brought these characters to life. It's interesting that, in their attempt to modernize Shakespeare for 90s audiences, the film now feels like more of a time capsule of 90s coolness. But when it comes to time capsules of mid-90s cool, perhaps nothing can touch. Number 18. Hackers, 1995. If you want a movie to thank for popularizing the sunglasses, leather, and techno fusion, look no further. Hackers is a fun snapshot of our quirky outlook on technology as we move toward the new millennium. It came out during a window when computers were set to take over our lives, but your average person could barely use one. Because of that, the movie could put any crazy technological, cyber hacking idea on screen, as long as it looked cool. The result was a dated but endlessly entertaining interpretation of where our virtual realities were headed. The movie was a trailblazer of 90s cool and pushed everything to its furthest extremes. And for another movie with lots of fun 90s technology, there's also Number 17, Demolition Man, 1993. In the early 90s, Stallone was falling behind in his rivalry with Arnold. He needed a cyberpunk-inspired classic of his own to bring his brand into the new decade. And his first attempt was a good one. Demolition Man takes us to the far-off time of 2032, where crime has mostly been abolished. A future that's totally unprepared for a 90s extreme cop and his sadistically evil gangster nemesis. The rivalry between Stallone and Snipes in this movie is great, with their fights being some of the best of early 90s action. But in the end, it was Snipes who stole the show. This role was an important showcase of Snipes' prowess as a martial arts action star. The other highlight of the movie is its great production value, with impressive sets, costumes, and vehicle designs that made its future look convincing. Stallone had an alien work ethic at that time, which makes sense considering what we learned in Number 16, Men in Black, 1997. We've all heard those urban legends where there was some kind of spaceship crash and a government cover-up. Well, what if it was all real? But instead of being scary, the aliens were mostly harmless goofballs who are hiding in plain sight. And that's the premise of this movie. It's such a fun and simple premise that the film takes full advantage of. The Men in Black are your classic buddy cop duo, played by Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. Their pairing was so good that they immediately became an iconic movie duo. But the unsung hero of this movie is definitely Vincent D'Onofrio. His performance was distorted, disgusting, and felt truly alien. Overall, the film's good blend of action and comedy and his cheesy theme song by Will Smith made it an inescapable touchstone of the 90s. And 2 years earlier, another Man in Black dominated the cinemas in Number 15, Batman Forever, 1995. Batman Forever was my favorite movie when I was a kid, but I understand why it's so divisive. There were some questionable choices, like Tommy Lee Jones' awful portrayal of Two-Face. It also leans into the campier side of Batman's mythology, which isn't for everyone. But if you can accept the movie for what it is, there's a lot to love. For starters, its vision of Gotham City as this scummy, neon hellscape feels right out of a comic book. It's also a rare Batman movie where Batman is actually the focus of the story. I've always thought that pairing Batman with the psychiatrist was an inspired choice, especially if it's Nicole Kidman in 1995. For me, Val Kilmer is still the best live-action Batman we've ever had, with the perfect voice to go with the cowl. And as a huge fan of the dynamic duo, I always feel pumped to see Batman and Robin team up against Two-Face and the Riddler for their final Number 14, Face Off, 1997. Face Off is the definition of turn your brain off popcorn fun. The film follows a good guy cop played by John Travolta who trades his face and his life with his evil terrorist nemesis played by Nick Cage. A goofy premise like this could only work with the right actors to sell it, and needless to say, Nick Cage and John Travolta were the right guys for the job. The amount of enjoyment these two are having, one-upping each other's hammy performances, is a joy to watch. The trading places angle also led to some cool visuals, like Cage and Travolta standing off against their mirror reflections, or the face-switching scene, which represents some of the best of weird 90s futuristic technology. The film was also directed by John Woo, who was at the top of his game. His gun-fu action influence could be found all over the 90s in films like Number 13, Desperado, 1995. Desperado is proof that in some cases, all you need is style. The movie opens with one of the best character introductions ever, as Steve Buscemi embellishes the story of El Mariachi, the most badass gunslinger who ever lived. And when El Mariachi makes his debut with his signature guitar case filled with guns, he lives up to the legend. There's a certain beauty in the film's simplicity, as its revenge plot is more of an excuse to keep you in its sexy, action-packed world. It's short, to the point, and gives you exactly what you want to see. Exciting standoffs, fun weapons, stylish gunfights, and Salma Hayek. Robert Rodriguez was on fire at that time, and just a year later gave us another south-of-the-border 90s cool classic with Number 12, From Dusk Till Dawn, 1996. From Dusk Till Dawn follows two criminal brothers who are on the run, played by George Clooney and Quentin Tarantino. The first part of the movie is intense, as the morally bankrupt brothers make their way to Mexico by taking a pastor and his children hostage. And once they arrive at a skeevy dive bar, the film's tone changes dramatically, from the real to the surreal. This dingy bar is one of my favorite movie settings ever. An underground pit fixed with garish neon signs, filled with the scum of the earth, beautiful women, and a mysterious atmosphere. And once things kick off at the bar, it becomes a bloody good time. From Dusk Till Dawn is evidence of just how much influence Tarantino had on 90s cool, as he had writing credits on this movie and Number 11, Natural Born Killers, 1994. Natural Born Killers explores the lives of a mass murderer couple and the media frenzy surrounding them. The movie feels like a deranged, psychedelic experience as it constantly switches between the style of 90s television staples like sitcoms, news shows, and music videos. It delivers a heavy-handed critique of our cultural celebration and fetishization of criminals, something that was happening then and is still just as relevant today. This twisted journey was carried by some great performances, like Robert Downey Jr.'s scumbag reporter and Woody Harrelson as one of the most convincing psychopaths in movie history. In the movie, Harrelson had one of the most iconic looks of 90s cool, with his leather jacket and those crimson T-shade sunglasses. This movie is a tour de force of violent 90s edginess, which could also be said for Number 10, The Boondock Saints, 1999. In The Boondock Saints, two Irish-American brothers bring their own brand of vigilante justice to Boston's criminal underworld. The film has such a unique style, combining vulgar humor and violent action with traditional Catholic imagery. The two protagonists, the McManus brothers, are your typical bar-brawling, beer-loving lads, but they also have a strong moral code which makes them easy to root for. Norman Reedus and Sean Patrick Flannery look and feel like real brothers, and their optimism in everything they do makes them so much fun to watch. Willem Dafoe also delivers a standout performance as a flamboyant detective who's in pursuit of the brothers. His investigation presents the action scenes in a creative way, where Dafoe is recreating everything in his mind after the fact. The movie is a fun, violent ride. And if you want to keep partying like it's 1999, there's also Number 9, Strange Days, 1995. Strange Days is a sci-fi thriller that captured our anticipation for the future as we headed into the new millennium. The film's driving plot device is a brain scanner that lets you experience a moment in someone else's life. This device leads a down-on-his-luck ex-cop played by Ralph Fiennes and his no-nonsense limo-driving friend played by Angela Bassett to uncover a conspiracy that could shake the foundations of society. The story is dark and at times disturbing, dealing with hot-button social issues in the wake of the LA riots. And while the film's plot is solid, its main drawing point is its fascinating depiction of LA in 1999. It's a heavily cyberpunk-inspired look at the near future, with lots of black leather, technology, and neon clubs. The film was a financial failure, but is thankfully getting more recognition due to its clear influence on the popular video game Cyberpunk 2077. Strange Days is one of the best dark thrillers of the 90s, in the company of other classics like Number 8, Dark City, 1998. Dark City is like the noir cousin of The Matrix. Hell, they even famously shared some of the same sets. The film begins when its protagonist wakes up in the middle of a murder scene with no recollection of the night before. Convinced that he isn't the culprit, he goes on a search for answers that leads him down a spiraling path that's deeper than he can imagine, all while being pursued by a group of nightmarish-looking slender men, known as the Strangers. On the first viewing, Dark City is a strange and confusing movie, but once it hooks you, it's the kind of enthralling mystery that you can't stop watching until you have all the answers. Alex Proyas did a great job taking the dark and moody atmosphere he created in The Crow and raising it to new heights. 1998 was a great year for dark, trenchcoat action, as it also gave us Number 7, Blade, 1998. Blade is one of the highest grade examples of 90s cool in existence. With leather and sunglasses galore, awesome techno tracks, and some slickly choreographed martial arts action. It's also an example of how this style meshed seamlessly with vampires. Wesley Snipes was fantastic as Blade, with a look and attitude so badass that he completely redefined the character. And aside from Snipes, the whole cast is great. From Blade's gruff father figure Whistler to the most Gen X vampire ever in Deacon Frost. Put simply, Blade is a kick-ass, stylish action movie that feels a lot like The Matrix before The Matrix. Whenever I see Blade catch his sunglasses, ready to slice and dice some vampires, it always gets me pumped up. Blade is such an effective vampire killer that you could basically call him a professional. Kind of like Number 6, Leon the Professional, 1994. Leon is like a lone wolf and cub story, updated for the dark and edgy 90s. In the film, a stone-cold contract killer named Leon is forced to take care of a young girl from a broken home named Matilda. The core of the film is in their unlikely partnership as Matilda persuades Leon to train her in the assassin business. Their dynamic runs the gamut of emotions, from sweet and endearing moments to intense and even uncomfortable places. But in the end, their journey together is unforgettable. In addition, Gary Oldman gives a chilling performance as the film's villain, Stansfield. He adds so many interesting quirks to the character and just commands your attention every time he's on screen. Leon was one of the 3 films that opened the floodgates for 90s cool in 1994, alongside of Natural Born Killers and Number 5, The Crow, 1994. In my mind, The Crow is one of the most unsung, influential movies of the 90s. Coming out at the height of the counterculture movement, the film combines so many emerging trends into something fresh and new. One example is the Devil's Night shootout scene, which combined gun fu, martial arts, and katana action into one package. This scene helped kick off the trend of gun and sword-based action that became common in dark fantasy movies and games. In addition, Brandon Lee's performance as Eric Draven was so unique at the time, playing a dark, tortured bad boy with a quirky sense of humor. Every time I watch interviews with Lee, it's clear what a special, forward-thinking talent he was. Because of that, whenever I watch The Crow, I'm always left with a feeling of sadness at what could have been. At the same time, it also stands as a timeless tribute to Lee's legacy. The Crow is a 90s classic that helped create an era where grungy films could flourish, like Number 4, Seven, 1995. In Seven, two detectives investigate a series of killings that are inspired by the 7 deadly sins. These killings continue to build on each other as the investigation mounts to a stunning conclusion. If film grunge was in the dictionary, then a picture of Seven would be right next to it. During the film, we're taken to so many dark, dilapidated, disturbing locations that are so visually striking and unforgettable. And equally unforgettable is the film's villain. From the first kill onwards, the tension generated by the mystery of the killer's identity and motivations is captivating. Without giving too much away, Seven's final act is one of the most memorable in movie history. Once the story finally comes to a head, it's the kind of thing that you can't stop thinking about for days. Just like women couldn't stop thinking about Brad Pitt in the 90s, in films like this and Number 3, Fight Club, 1999. Fight Club is a captivating snapshot of the nihilistic, rebellious spirit of Gen X, right before 9/11 changed the world. A generation that felt like the middle children of history, living at a time of peace without purpose. Despite being made for a specific time and generation, the film's message will always remain relevant. And that's because it speaks to the male psyche in a way that'll differ depending on when you watch it. An angst-filled teenager might be drawn to Tyler Durden's cool factor and want to emulate his carefree, anarchistic lifestyle. Someone older will likely resonate with Ed Norton's existential crisis and struggle to find meaning in a vapid, consumerist society. Regardless of where you stand, there's something about the film that hits in a deeply personal way. Fight Club represents the very best of edgy 90s cinema. But for the best action, you'll have to go back to Number 2, Terminator 2, 1991. Terminator 2 is the definition of timeless. Instead of making another gritty cyber slasher like the first film, James Cameron took the series in a more crowd-pleasing, action-oriented direction. This change is reflected by Arnold's performance with one of the best face turns in movie history. In T2, the Terminator has to protect the rebellious, future savior of humanity, John Connor. This relationship humanizes the Terminator and leads to a number of funny and touching moments. The film also updated Sarah Connor to be one of the most badass female action heroes in history. And it had one of the best villains ever, the cold-blooded killing machine, the T-1000. This Terminator's liquid metal form made for some mind-blowing special effects scenes that still hold up. These phases of 90s cool were bookended by two of the best action classics ever, starting with T2 in 91 and ending with Number 1, The Matrix, 1999. If you already saw my last list of the best 90s cool movies, you may have noticed some changes. But in the world of sunglasses and gunfights, one fact will always remain constant. The Matrix is the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. The movie is like a summary of everything 90s cool done to perfection. It had the peak aesthetic, top-level action, and an amazing soundtrack. It wasn't short on originality either, with its bullet time sequence revolutionizing action movies. But when you look past all of the flashier aspects, what makes The Matrix special is its impeccable foundation. It's one of those rare movies where there isn't a single wasted moment and every part is impactful. There are the standout moments like the stunning opening chase scene or Neo versus Agent Smith, but even the smaller moments leave their mark. I could talk about how awesome The Matrix is forever, but suffice to say, it was the perfect send-off not only for the 1990s, but the entire millennium. And so ends my list of the top 90s cool movies that were made in the 1990s. I hope that with this list, the name 90s cool will cause less confusion, because it was an awesome movement that was founded, defined, and iconicized all within a single decade. But just like the world didn't end with the Y2K scare, neither did this style. The Matrix kicked down the door for the new millennium and made the trend more popular than ever. But was that a good thing or not? Find out next time as we look at the best of 90s cool, all 2000s edition.